In today's video, I wanted to go through another challenge run in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. However, this time it's going to be a little bit different. It isn't necessarily objectively challenging, rather it's subjectively challenging. For this playthrough, I'm going to embark on the Mages Guild questline while role-playing as a stealth archer. Archery and stealth really aren't my forte in the Elder Scrolls games, and that's why I really wanted to test it out and see what all the chatter was about. Think of this video as one that involves testing out a certain build for the sake of curiosity. It will be a lengthy play-by-play and personal review of my time playing as this class. Of course, it mostly deals with the questline, but there will be other little details and elements of storytelling added in. It isn't meant to be a recounting of the storyline, as that's already up on my channel, but of course, there are elements of that in this playthrough. Next time, I'll be doing an actual kind of more obscure challenge run, but for now, it's time to try out this build. With all of that out of the way, let's begin. My character's name is Bringle, but for the video's sake, we'll call him Bringle 1.0 for now, and you'll see why. Bringle is a Wood Elf, the very first race I ever played as in Oblivion. Lore-wise, Wood Elves are decent at sneaking and have impressive marksmanship, but I've also just been itching to play as one lately. Bringle 1.0's birth sign is the Thief, for the added bonuses to agility, speed, and luck. As for his class, I decided to make a custom one based on the actual assassin class. I didn't want alchemy as a major skill or intelligence as a favorite attribute, so I swapped those out. Instead, my full class setup goes as follows. Specialization is stealth, favorite attributes are agility and speed, and the major skills are sneak, marksman, blade, illusion, light armor, acrobatics, and security. Illusion was supposed to be for casting Chameleon to sneak around, but as you'll see, there's a reason he's Bringle 1.0. Also, Blade was picked as a backup weapon type, but quickly gets underutilized as the story progresses. Because this character is recycled for every new character I make, I usually start out at the end of the sewers. What's more, the character I initially did the tutorial with wasn't supposed to start out with any loot, gold, etc. So, even while trying to retrace my steps through the sewers, picking up what I could, there wasn't much for Bringle to start out with. After the sewers, the first place I went was Vilverin for some bandit gear. Here, I could get some of their light armor, as well as an iron bow and some arrows. With my new weapon in hand, I wanted to try out some target practice with more bandits. There's something really satisfying about lining up a long-distance shot and having it connect with your target. Obviously, my first interaction didn't go very well in terms of stealth, but after retrying, things went smoother. I was able to get some sneak attack bonuses, resulting in instant deaths for many of my enemies. This was mostly how I wanted to play. The goal was to stealth kill all of my opponents and remain undetected. As you'll come to see, I got better at it as time went on, but for now, I was just collecting my bearings. Some concerns going into this were obviously running out of arrows and my sneak attacks being unable to one-shot NPCs. Both of these issues get addressed as time goes on, but after Vilverin, I was feeling good and ready to start my journey. I had looted as much as I could from the Iliad ruins in preparation to buy some supplies, and I was mostly kitted out with the weapons and armor I wanted. My first stop was the Imperial City Market District. Heading inside the Slash and Smash, I sold Herbal my extra goods and picked up a bunch more arrows on the way out. My next stop was the Gilded Carafe, where I checked for some poisons but didn't find the ones I wanted. So I decided to pay a visit to Shady Sam. Fun fact about Sam, I had never used his services before, and that's because I had no clue he even existed until a few weeks ago. It was honestly pretty surreal to encounter a new NPC like this. Unfortunately though, Sam wasn't offering any of his services to me, and I think it had to do with my disposition, though I'm not 100% sure. Regardless, I gave up on my dream of getting poisons for now. Everybody, I'd like to show you the root cause of why there's Bringle 1.0 and Bringle 2.0. I decided to artificially boost my sneak using the classic exploits. It's incredibly easy to cheese your way up with sneak in the Elder Scrolls games, and honestly, if it wasn't one of my major skills, it might have worked out in my favor too. As for what I did, I went inside the Gilded Carafe and found the perfect pocket within the stone walls to sneak near Claudette Perrick. The skill went up, and so did my overall player level. Of course, I didn't just sit here for a couple of hours, I simply used console commands to get the rest of the way there, but you get the idea of how easy it is to increase your skill level. Reaching master levels of sneak, the game notified me that my sneak attacks now pierced through enemy armor, and I was super excited to try it out. Heading over to a vacant bed, I went all the way up to level 7 and put most of my extra skill points into speed, agility, and luck. Again, another small mistake on my part. Soon enough, Bringle 2.0 will make an appearance, rectifying almost everything, but for now, it's time to start with the Mages Guild recommendations. I wanted to get all of the ones that didn't involve dungeon raiding and exploration out of the way first. So, to quickly gloss over these parts, the first one I did was the Bruma recommendation. Speaking with Jean, she was actually my induction into the guild, and from there, her task for me was to find Jaskar. Raising Valinaro's disposition and inquiring about the Gajit, he tells me he'll only help me find him if I steal Jean's manual of spellcraft from her office. Breaking into the very easy lock and grabbing the book, the Altmer then tells me to meet him after 10 PM in the basement. Doing so, Valinaro casts a spell and takes away Jaskar's invisibility. The two men talk about which prank to pull next on Jean, and I go cash in on her promise. The next guild hall I go to is Shaden Halls. Speaking with Falkar, he tells me to go retrieve his ring from the well outside and directs me to Deetsan for more information. Deetsan, suspicious of Falkar, tells me to come back later so we can discuss some of her concerns in private. Doing so, she warns me that the last associate who attempted this task was never seen again. She teaches me a water-breathing spell for my safety and hands me the well key. I couldn't remember how much the ring of burden weighed, thinking I might be okay to carry it. When I saw it was 150 pounds, I knew I had to stash my gear away. Usually, I just put everything in Vidkun's inventory, but for some reason, I forgot about doing that this time. Regardless, I picked up the ring and went back to Deetsan. She tells me of Falkar's sick game and how he was trying to get me killed. She then tells me to check and see if he wrote a recommendation for me in the meantime. Descending to his chambers, I only find the black soul gems. Deetsan takes them away from me and writes one on his behalf. The next guild hall I head for is that of Breville's. Talking with Kudai, she tells me that Ardeline has had her mage's staff stolen by Varen Vamori, and that my task is to get it back for her. She gives me a charm scroll and I pathetically fire it off at him. Trying again, this time he tells me that he sold it to his friend in the Imperial City, Soris Aranim. Reporting back to Kudai, she gives me more charming scrolls and sends me on my way. Heading inside of Soris's home, I sort of remember how this quest played out, so I just went straight for the staff in the basement. In order to sneak down there though, I had to get him and his partner out of eyeshot. I literally forcefully moved their bodies around the corner until I was completely undetected, and then I made my moves. Staff in hand, I returned back to Breville and completed my quest. In between all of these recommendations, I've been stealing a lot of equipment from the halls, mostly alchemy tools, as they fetch a nice and consistent price. I sold them off to some merchants, and then went and bought the chameleon spell from Ida Rienis of the Breville Mages Guild. I was really excited to use it, up until I realized that I didn't have enough magicka for it. If I had picked intelligence as a favorite attribute, or at least put some of my level up points into it, maybe that could have worked. But again, another one of my plans wasn't really coming to fruition. Anyways, the playthrough goes on, and my next recommendation was at the Coral Guild Hall. Tychius' task had me seeking out the estranged Irana, who then told me she was looking for the Fingers of the Mountain book. She asked me to get it for her at the location of Cloudtop. Reporting back to Tychius, he was insistent that the book shouldn't get handed over to her, and that it should be brought back to the hands of the guild. I've always been interested in Irana's motives and the nature of this book. Both of the guild and her greatly value it, and other than her notes, we don't receive much information regarding it. It obviously has something to do with the aliens, and certain powers they possessed long ago, but the rest of it, we're pretty much left in the dark on. Maybe it's for the better too, as it creates more mystery and questions this way. The route to Cloudtop was relatively void of combat. Other than one imp along the way, I made it to the ruins with no problem and snagged the book from the charred corpse. Technically, there's an extended version of this quest which offers the player more rewards, but for the sake of progress, I just handed the book over to Tychius and went on my way. The next recommendation was for the Anvil Guild Hall. This was sort of where the action was starting to pick up, but not by a whole lot. Carahill told me of the murders near Brina Cross Inn, and I set off for the establishment. Meeting with Ariel Gerard, she told me to rent a room and that we'd talk there privately. The proprietor, Christoph, tells me about the murders and how they've been bad for business. The wandering high elf, Kamenelda, approaches me and tells me how scary it is during these times. It's funny that once you know that she's the killer, this conversation is so obvious and implicating for her. Upstairs, Gerard tells me of the plans and I rest at the inn for the night. Getting ready to leave, of course, Kamenelda is nowhere to be found down in the main area. A little bit down the road, she jumps out of the bushes and begins attacking me. At this point, I wasn't sure the exact playstyle I wanted to go for. I knew that I wanted most of my quest-based interactions to be stealth kills, or at least initiated by stealth, but I wasn't sure how I felt about open combat. So for now, I just ran back and forth along the Gold Road, as the battle mages and a legionnaire tackled Kamenelda. At the beginning of the fight, one of the mage's flame atronachs accidentally hit the legionnaire's horse, and that started a whole tussle between the Empire and the Mages Guild. Well after the serial killer Altmer was defeated, the three of them were still duking it out. Curious to see who would come out on top, I stuck around until the end of the fight. Of course, the Imperial soldier slashed his way through my fellow guildmates, and all I could really do was watch. Looting Kamenelda's corpse, I took the key to her room and was pretty excited to see what treasure lay inside. I quickly remembered though that it was a fairly underwhelming bonus. Returning to the guild hall, Garhill promised that she'd write up my recommendation, and finally, the real fun was about to begin. With it though was also the Great Bringle Reset, as I'll call it. Heading to Leyawiin next, I spoke with the Gale who asked me to silence the voices for her. Agata told me about the missing Seer Stone and that I should ask around for it. Kalthar, one of the more off-putting NPCs in the game, reveals his bitter and angry side. He tells me that Degale's father actually had a stone buried with him. The zany Bosmer then shares the location of the fort with me, and it's now time to get some action in. The walk to Fort Blueblood isn't too far from the city, with only a couple of nuisance creatures on the way. Arriving at the ruins, I laid eyes on my first humanoid enemy and set up the shot. Firing off what I thought was going to be the best sneak attack arrow, it ended up only lowering her health by about 2/5. Every arrow after that didn't do too much damage either, and even worse was my dagger. This was when I decided to redo my character Bringle. The playstyle I wanted to go for wasn't really an option with these stats and gear, so it was back to the drawing board. Of course, I knew that there were other things that could have been altered to balance out the gameplay, like raising my marksman skill, giving myself better gear, or changing sneak to a minor skill and getting to 100 again. However, I wanted to try and be as organic as possible, just so I could get the most fun experience possible. There were a few changes made to my custom class during this time, along with some aesthetics, although those aren't super important. Bringle's profile changed to a slightly younger and more spry wood elf. His star sign stayed the same, and so did his specialization, favorite attributes, and most of his skills. The only one I ended up changing out was Illusion, as I didn't see myself being able to cast Chameleon for a while. I swapped it for Athletics because, to be honest, I wasn't too sure what else to take. And then from there, I was ready to resume the journey. This time, however, there were a few things that I skipped out on doing, both intentionally and unintentionally. I completely forgot to loot the rest of the sewers, so I missed out on some lockpicks and extra arrows. After nearly dying to the bandits outside of Vilverin, I took their gear and forwent going inside of the ruins for more experience. I rejoined the Mages Guild and caught up to exactly where I left off. This time with no skills boosted to unnatural amounts. Outside of Fort Blueblood, I tried to locate that pesky first bandit, but they were nowhere to be found. Deciding to move inside of the fort, my Rambo style of gameplay had begun. Sticking to the shadows and maneuvering around in the dark, the first couple of marauders took more than one shot to take down. This was more than likely due to their heavy armor, but regardless, an extra arrow in their breastplate did the trick. In the next area, I got my first sneak attack takedown, and it was honestly really satisfying to watch. Immediately afterwards, I was spotted by a lone enemy though, and had to resume my flee and shoot strategy. Again, these first few dungeons were meant to gain some skill in stealth and archery. Knowing that I was strapped for gold, I tried my best to loot as much of the efficient equipment as possible, so weapons, armor, potions, gems, etc. Entering into the next zone, Fort Blueblood Halls, I faced down a mix of marauders that varied in arrow hits to kill. The first encounter took 2 shots, while the next one was an interesting duo. It only took one to assassinate the Altmer, which again, so satisfying, but immediately His partner came running in at me after noticing the kill. This was something that I was going to have to work on for future missions, but luckily, the fellow archer only needed 2 hits to be done in. The next little area actually went really smooth. I silently took down a guard posted on some stairs and lined up a nice shot for another marauder across the way. That was 2 out of 3 enemies defeated, but I knew the last one was a powerful warlord. I tried my best to jump around from the pillars and on little edges along the wall, solely to stay out of reach and to keep things fresh. Finally, after some 360 no-scopes, the orc was down and all that remained was the final room. I looted my arrows back along with a key and went on through the doors. Inside, I shot down one of 2 imps from the shadows and had to directly fight the other one, although it wasn't at all tricky. Looting Manduin's coffin, I found the extra seer stone and prepared myself for the next encounter. I wasn't sure on how I wanted to handle it. I was curious if Calthar needed to interact with me in order to progress for this next part, or if I could just kill him and take the key. I got in close to the stairwell to trigger his running animations and hid behind a pillar. He reached my spot and just stood in the shadows with me, although the game did register it as me being undetected. I got off an attack on him and our battle began. I'll skip over the fight as it only ended with him going unconscious, so I reverted back, got confronted, and fought him all over again. Even without the element of surprise, I found the brawl with Calthar easier this time, as every single arrow hit its mark. In no time, he was dead, and I was able to return the amulet back to Degale. Doing so, she wrote off my recommendation, and it was now down to the last one. I was pretty happy with how that first experience went down. I was able to get some decent sneak attacks in with one-shot takedowns, and that's really what I wanted more of. Marauders have better armor and gear than the Necromancers do, so there was a lot of promise with this build for this specific questline. In Skingrad, I spoke with Adrienne Barain, and she gave me the task of finding Airthor. Asking around the hall, I collected enough information from Druzha and Vig the Cautious, then went on my way. Bleakflat's cave wasn't far off from town, but I knew I was going to have some trouble inside the actual dungeon itself. Pretty much all of the enemies encountered were zombies, and without decent gear or fire abilities, they were going to be a pain to put down. Even with a 3 times damage multiplier, their health bars barely moved at all. Every arrow that pierced their rotting bodies would only result in slivers of health being taken away. Wanting to preserve my arrows, I switched over to the dagger, only to have it deal meaningless amounts of damage. My time through Bleakflat's cave was fairly bleak to say the least. It took a while to move through the dungeon, as the process for defeating the zombies was a repetitive cycle. At one point, I pulled 2 of them at the same time and was worried I'd get overwhelmed. But it really just opened my eyes to how effective bows were for this character compared to daggers, as this was where I put down the blade for good. In terms of being a successful stealth archer, this quest was a pretty bad experience. However, brighter days were soon to come. I located Airthor and told him we could leave the cave together. My question from the original Mages Guild video still stands. Was he practicing necromancy in the cave? He was sent here to do his experiments away from the guild. Was he in over his head for raising the dead and needed a bailout? Who's to say? Regardless, with Airthor safely brought back to the hall, Adrienne assured me she would write my final recommendation. Before leaving, I stole more alchemy supplies from the hall and sold them to Leyawiin and Breville. Following that, I visited a store I've never once set foot in, the Archer's Paradox. I know I'm super late to the party here, but it's definitely neat that they added in a specialized shop for those who want to pursue the path of the marksman. Here, I bought a pretty cheap steel bow and replenished my iron arrows. New weapon in hand, I fast traveled to the Arcane University and met with Raminus Polis. Polis welcomed me to the grounds and set me up with my first task, making a mage's staff. I was pretty excited to finally practice my skills against some necromancers. Arriving at Wellspring Cave, I hid in the shadows as one of them wandered into my view. I fired off my shot and their body flung backwards as the arrow made impact. Again, such an awesome feeling. By the necromancer, I discovered the body of Zarasha and continued onwards. The next 2 takedowns felt equally as rewarding. As I moved towards the exit of the cave, I flew too close to the sun and ended up face to face with the interior's final enemy. Forced to let loose some arrows as he fought back, I managed to still kill him in about 2 or so hits. Leaving the cavern and finding myself out in the waterfront, I fired an arrow at the quickly approaching Noveni Othrin. She was able to conjure her undead and get in close for some attacks. Luckily though, with about 3 arrows, Noveni was dead, and her other 2 lackeys didn't spot me. I was able to perform a stealth takedown on each of them, getting those satisfying one-shot, one-kill moments. After all was said and done, Aletta's body was discovered, and the unfinished mage's staff was obtained. Obviously, this experience was a lot shorter than the 2 previous ones, but to me, it felt like it went a whole lot better. I really enjoyed the silent assassin approach, and without trying to spoil too much, this build does really well for the Mages Guild. Returning back to Raminus, he told me to visit Delmar in the Chironasium in order to complete the staff. Heading over there, I waited until daytime for the Red Guard to make an appearance, but even then, I was struggling to find him. Finally, I looked up the stairs and saw that he had gotten himself into a sticky situation. A warning to everybody currently watching, speaking with him was a bit of a nightmare.
Ah, yes. This is a big step for you, friend, whether you know it or not. Now you'll need to decide what sort of staff you're looking for.
Simultaneously, I tried to pick a decent staff and also tried to get this whole exchange over with, as motion sickness was setting in. I went with a paralyzing effect in case I needed to stop an enemy in their tracks. Waiting 24 hours, Delmar was still flipping out on the staircase until eventually he clipped out of the world and popped up right in front of his colleague. A true magician's trick. Regardless though, my staff was ready and I returned back to Raminus. Mr. Polis promoted me to the rank of Journeyman and then sent me off to retrieve a book from Count Hasseldor of Skingrad. For this one, I wondered what the best strategy was going to be for stealthily taking down Mercator and his companions. I set up the meeting and got myself into position just outside of town. Waiting until 2 AM, Glarthur decided that now was the best time to offer me his PI job. Shooing him away, the trio finally arrived and started to slowly approach. I backed up as far as I could, and soon they lost interest in my whereabouts. They stopped on the quest marker, and I was actually able to hide in the bushes and shoot each of them down one by one. This little workaround is actually really neat and useful, and it's something I'd probably do again going forward. For Mercator, I was worried that attacking him would count as a crime, in case the game still registered him as a friendly NPC. Luckily, it didn't, and one arrow took him down to less than half health. As I kited him around the fields, like Clark Kent himself, Count Hasseldor appeared out of nowhere and threw the best flying right hook I've ever seen. Too bad he missed though, and I was the one to finish off Mercator. The Count and I then had a little chat about how he's not with the Necromancers, that the guild used me as there was never any book, and that next time they should be more direct with what they want from him. Returning to Raminus, he floundered around for a bit trying to explain why the guild was justified in risking my life. Afterwards, he promoted me to the rank of Evoker and sent me to speak with the man himself, Erlov Gerol. Gerol told me about Vatican and how the mages there are struggling to progress further in their research. Before heading there, I sold off some of my loot and stolen goods to Jensine in the market district, and with the gold amassed, I took 2 grand soul gems from a display case in the Archmage's Tower and used one of them to enhance my steel bow. I enchanted it with some fire damage, keeping the area and duration as their defaults and upping the magnitude to 5. I cleverly named it Firebow, and jokes aside, I was really eager to use it. Aside from wanting a more powerful weapon, I also needed something that would take care of any ghosts or spirits found in Vatican. Arriving on site, I looked around for a bit, looting the petty containers, and then wandered up to Scalil near the research area. She expressed her disinterest in the project, explaining how they're stumped on what to do with the pillar. Running over to Denel, I took all of the scrolls in his chest and spoke with the Imperial. He told me how Scalil has the book that could help us solve the puzzle. Getting it from her, I then went around to the 4 tablets in the room and got their translations. If I had actually remembered this part, this would have been an easy step to skip, but I honestly was pretty lost myself. Relearning that I had to cast a Fire, Frost, Fortify Magicka, and Drain Magicka spell, I started using the scrolls only to realize that a Frost one wasn't included. Doing some external research, I located a Snowball scroll in Bruma and retrieved it. With every spell cast, the pillars moved around, and it was time to turn into Rambo again. The first enemy I encountered was a ghost, and I felt pretty happy about choosing now to enchant my bow. The next set of ghosts were supposed to be a surprise attack. but remembering this encounter, I backtracked off the pressure plate and retreated into the shadows. Peering around both corners, I fired off an arrow at a small exposed part of the spirit and one-shotted the pair. Attempting to press onwards, I utterly failed at crossing through a trap, and that resulted in my first death. Successfully getting through it this time, I snuck a shot in at another ghost's hand and ended up in the desired chamber. Gaining access to the elevated platform and revealing the alien helm, multiple skeletons spawned and closed in for the attack. Fortunately, they decided to just stand around the base of the platform, making for easy target practice. A few ghosts also appeared near where I pressed the first button, but they were also a one-shot, one-kill scenario. Exiting the ruins, I brought the helm over to Skalil, who then told me to present it to Jirol right away. Returning to the university, Erlov was ecstatic about the discovery, and Raminis got straight into his last task for me. He explained the increasing necromancer threat and determined that it was time the guild looks into their production of black soul gems. He promoted me to the rank of conjurer, and from there, I sought out Tarmina within the Mystic Archives. Tarmina was pretty standoffish and busy at first, but once she heard what I was there for, she let up a bit. She told me about the book, Necromancer's Moon, which was previously taken out by Falkar. She knows it's around the archives somewhere, but isn't sure on its exact spot. Looking around briefly, I found it on one of these side tables in the corner and brought it over to Raminis. He mentioned the shade of the remnant celestial phenomenon and directed me to Bothiel over in the tower to get more information. Speaking with her, she tells me that she recently read about it in one of Falkar's displaced notes. Bringing the note to Polis, he specifically points out the Dark Fissure, south of Shadenhall, as being a point of interest. Before heading out on my next adventure, I paid a visit to the Slash and Smash in order to sell some items and repair others. With fresh gear in hand, I traveled over to Vatican and ascended to the Dark Fissure. A pretty cool detail that I've never noticed before was the beam of light that shines down on the altar. I wasn't sure if it was always like that, or if perhaps this was the day the celestial event would occur. Regardless, I got in close to it and noticed a necromancer standing right behind. I tried to get in close while staying out of sight, but every time I crossed a certain threshold, he would see me and begin attacking. I tried approaching from different angles, and even with the one I felt the most hidden, he was still somehow able to spot me. It was a fight I certainly could have taken head on, but I really wanted to use the element of surprise. So I waited until nightfall for more darkness, but he had actually retreated back into the cave. Following behind, he was standing right near the entrance and had apparently already seen me. Thinking it was over, I took one step backwards and fell back to being undetected, which was perfect. I got a sneak attack in for about 1/3 of his health, and the battle had begun. He conjured in a ghost, which body blocked for him pretty nicely. Oddly enough, he fell back into the cave a bit more and started attacking another necromancer. I have no idea how they aggroed onto each other, but it worked out in my favor, and soon, the worm anchorite was defeated. On his person, he had a handwritten note, which, when picked up, gave me the go-ahead to return back to the university. Running back outside, the frenemy necromancer followed, and with a few shots from my bow, she too was killed. Fast traveling back to Raminis, I told him how they're using the stars and altars to transform the black soul gems. He fears for their power and numbers, but puts that to the side for now. Raminis promotes me to the rank of magician and informs me that Hannibal Travin, the archmage, will be giving me my tasks from now on. So far, the stealth archer / assassin build has been a lot of fun to play with and has proven to be really effective. Of course, not all of my runs and quests so far have been extremely successful, but the ones that have gone well, I'd say were definitely some of my better moments. It feels like there's a lot of control with this build, and it requires a little more observational skills and awareness of my surroundings than, say, a warrior build. And honestly, it's a nice change of pace. Most of my initial concerns have been taken care of for now, with enemy grouping not being too much of an issue, and my quantity of arrows not really waning. Continuing with the questline, I sought out and spoke with Travin. His first task for me was to search for and rescue his necromancer informant, Musianus Elias. He's currently inside the ruins of Nenyan Twill, and there are battle mages purging the place as we speak. Traveling to the waterfront and walking my way to the alien ruin, I entered inside and encountered one of my favorite NPC interactions.
You! What are you doing here? Has the council gone mad, sending you here alone? There's no time. The others, they were waiting for us. They knew we were coming. I'm the only one left. The necromancers retreated further in, but we've got to follow them. There's no time to waste. Follow me.
I really do wonder if there's any way at all to save Fithragar. Maybe with some crazy buff spells, but it seems like no matter what, he was always destined to die in the spike trap. Regardless, facing the necromancers and undead were the least of my worries at this point. Somehow, I had attracted the attention of an ogre, and it tracked me all the way in here. I flailed around for a bit, desperately trying to get it off my tail. I tried to kill it in the spike trap, but it was really hard to match up the mechanism with the ogre's movements. Eventually, I realized that it didn't have that much health, and my bow was able to do some decent damage towards it. I was kind of scarred from facing ogres for the Fighters Guild playthrough that I forgot they aren't super scary and challenging foes. With that interaction behind me, I carried on through the ruin and came across some easier targets. There were plenty more necromancers and skeletons that would go down with one shot, and the satisfaction of it all continued. I find alien ruins easier to sneak around in than say caves or forts. This part could be my imagination, but it seems like they also have more shadows for the player to linger around in, but that part is probably unlikely. Maybe it's because the lit areas are more obvious than the fires and braziers within the caves and forts. In any case, the first zone of Nenyan Twill was a breeze to get past. The second zone brought me right in front of Mariette Riel. Instead of letting her approach me, I got off a cheap shot which almost killed her, but she pretty much entirely healed up and gave me a tough time. Just past her was the final area. It consisted of enemies that were spaced out and relatively easy to hit from long distances. One of the skeleton kills alerted a necromancer beside it, but upon running in close, she only took 2 arrows to defeat. I continued to move through the open room until finally, just about every enemy was defeated. I lowered the false wall, discovered a zombified Musianus, and then left the ruins. On the way out, I wasn't very careful and alerted the final necromancer. However, 3 arrows in her torso did the trick, and I was free and clear to return to the university. Travis was shocked to hear the news of Elias, and then told me to ask Raminus for a promotion. Ascending to the rank of Warlock, Travin then sent me off to Skingrad in order to meet with the Count again. Before doing so, I sold off some of my stolen goods and bought some more arrows at the Archer's Paradox. I was desperately awaiting the arrival of steel arrows, but they wouldn't come for quite some time. Traveling to the West Weald, I waited around for Janus, who told me he had some news. However, in order to get it out of him, he wanted me to clear out the vampires in Bloodcrust Cavern, as well as get rid of the hunters who have set up shop in the city. This was a quest I was actually pretty excited for, as the circuit of Bloodcrust Cavern is pretty perfect for stealth archers. I went ahead and sought out Eridor, the leader of the hunters. I wasn't sure what role I wanted them to play in this whole quest, whether they would go in and do the dirty work, or if I would kill them separately. Regardless, I sent them off to the cave, but not before I could get an early visit in. Deciding to do things for myself, I began my walkthrough in the shadows. Some of the vampires went down with a single shot, while others took more than a few to bring down. I think the spellcasters and less armored NPCs were affected a lot more by the sneak attacks, as even some unarmored melee users tanked the arrows. At one point, one of the vampires got a good swing at me with their claymore, causing me to contract porphyric hemophilia, my most feared disease. It's a very irrational fear, as I know it can easily be cured, and I have 3 days to do it, but for some reason, I get this sense of panic when it happens. Maybe it's because I'm worried that I'll forget about the disease and 3 days will go by, I'm really not sure. Regardless, I'd say most of the vampires in here went down with 2 to 3 arrows, even with the sneak attack multiplier. The fire enchantment on my bow certainly helps do the trick with killing them though, and eventually, all of them were eliminated. It wasn't as successful of a run as previous dungeons, but I did what I could with what I had. Just as I was about to leave, the hunters had showed up and were making their way out of the cave. I still had to deal with them for Hasseldor, so as Eridor's 3 men left, I tagged him from the back and shot him down by the entrance. Leaving, the 3 goons had no idea what had happened, so I just began firing on them. Luckily, because I was far away from the city limits, my actions didn't count as crimes, and I used the old back up and shoot trick. They really weren't much more difficult than the vampires, save for maybe the Nord for some reason. Soon though, the 3 of them were dead, and I was able to get the information out of the Count. He warned me to tell the guild of Amanda Marco's return and the rising forces of the Necromancers. Traven was shocked to hear at the return of this age-old enemy and said that the guild needed some time to decide on what to do. Waiting around for a couple of days, the Archmage finally informed me of the council's progress, which wasn't much, but sidetracked it all with a new task. Apparently, the Bruma guild hall has gone silent, and that's pretty abnormal for Jean Versoric. He wants me to travel north and check in on everything over there. This was also one of the quests that I had made a mental note for. I knew the enemies were going to be slightly tougher than necromancers, and that a stealth approach was going to be tricky to achieve. Entering inside of the guild hall, my heart sank a little when I saw that I had to deal with more zombies. There was no way I was able to one-shot them, and what's worse, I was spotted right away. So I figured for this one, why not do the opposite of stealth archery and get the whole city involved? I pulled some of the undead out and let the town put some work in. After all, they're the ones who let the necromancers slip in and out, resulting in the guild hall's demise. I'd repeatedly tried to re-enter inside of the hall and get some sneak attacks in, but almost every single time, a zombie would end up rounding the corner and surprise attack me. Luckily, there were some easier enemies in here like skeletons that could be crushed with around 2 or so arrows. The process of sneaking and getting caught right away would continue on for some time. My best way to combat multiple zombies in tight quarters and save on arrows was to just bring them outside and let the guards take care of them, and if I could, get some pot shots in. Otherwise, if it was just one attacker, I'd try my best for the flee and shoot method. Eventually, I made it to Jean's office and I was anticipating the necromancer encounter. I slowly snuck up the stairs and cracked open the door. Camilla Lollia was standing right in front of me facing the other direction. I let off a perfect arrow right at her back, which almost killed her, but unfortunately, she healed and I was forced to go through her dialogue anyways. The rest of the fight went pretty sound. She tried to throw a few punches at me, but 3 arrows in her sternum did the trick. Afterwards, Jaskar popped out, he told me that this was Mana Marco's doing, and together we returned to the Imperial City. Not my best efforts as a stealth archer, but sometimes you have to just roll with what you're given. Reporting back to Hannibal Traven, he said that the council needed some time to digest this information. In the meantime, I got promoted to the rank of wizard from Raminus Polis. After enough time passed, Traven told me that in a state of panic and hot-headedness, Erlov Giral took the Bloodworm Helm to Fort Telemann, and Karanya took the Necromancer's Amulet to Fort Ontis. He'd like me to go and retrieve the artifacts, along with the mages themselves. Before doing all of that, I sold some of my loot and Mages Guild goods off to the local merchants, and then paid another visit to the Archer's Paradox. This time, I went ahead and bought myself a fine iron bow, which had the same attack power as the steel bow. From here, I went over to the Mages Guild Chironasium and made an improved version of the firebow. This time, it dealt 10 fire damage and could be shot around 115 or so times. Appropriately, this one was named Flamebow. The first of the 2 quests I embarked on was the Necromancer's Amulet. From Bleakflat's cave, I traveled to Fort Ontis and prepared my battle plans. I knew that an assault was going to go down as soon as I spoke with Karanya. I tried to make mental note of where every single quote-unquote Mages Guild member was so I could lurk through the hallways and get my shots ready. As soon as I reached the chamber Karanya was in, I scrapped my original idea and thought of an even better one. I first tried it out with an Altmer in one of the corridors and it worked fantastically. Because the mages aren't my enemies yet, I was able to stealthily shoot them down in the hallways and no one batted an eye. There was no risk if they saw me, as they couldn't do anything about it or alert their allies. Honestly, I had no idea that this was even an option, and going forward, I figured why not do this every time I want to play through this questline. I shot down all of Karanya's goons like the game was on easy mode, and then I made my approach for her. Crouching in the darkness, I let off a lone arrow that struck her in the back and brought her HP down by about 1/6. Karanya was actually a pretty tricky fight. I remembered having problems fighting her with my high-level warrior, so a lowly archer who can't aim was definitely going to have some issues. Plus, she was very fidgety and moved around a lot, so that made for an even better time trying to tag her. After a long and hard-fought battle, I readied myself for victory as the last arrow pierced her, only to see that she would just get knocked unconscious. As it turns out, I had to speak with her first in order to make her non-essential. So I restarted the whole fight and actually died on my first real attempt. She brought her A game with the destruction magic and summoned a wraith to fight by her side instead of the skeleton. The next attempt went a lot better. She twitched and zigzagged a lot, making it hard for me to land hits, but luckily, if she backed up, there was no support for her from the other necromancers. Karanya also had an annoying habit of healing a lot. Every arrow that hit its mark resulted in her healing her wounds and practically negated any damage that I had done to her. Finally, after a bit of time, she was defeated and I was able to snag the Necromancer's amulet. I chose to leave through a new way, which was sort of pointless as I had killed most of the Necromancers blocking the original exit. This path out resulted in more fights and encounters with enemies. But regardless, I had made it out of the fort safely and returned the artifact back to Traven. It's funny because I feel like every quest that the Archmage makes me go on results in him being in disbelief for the information that I just gave to him. Every single one, he's shocked to hear whatever news I deliver. You'd think by now he would have caught on that the guild was down on their luck. Anyways, the next task was retrieving the Bloodworm Helm, and it brought me all the way out to Fort Telemann, northeast of Leyawiin. For this one, I knew that it was going to be an easier approach for a stealth archer, as it was the usual guards posted and patrolling type of dungeon. On the outside, I took out a necromancer in silence, but caught the attention of a skeleton archer. 2 quick hits though and it was defeated. Entering inside of the fort, I tried to pay extra attention to corners, hallways, and side rooms. I made slow advancements, mapping out each area and listening for footsteps and chatter. Again, it was a really cool way to play through this game. It's such a far off style from what I'm used to, and it feels like a very refreshing take on Oblivion itself. In terms of success as a stealth archer, Fort Telemann felt textbook and practically elementary compared to what I had to deal with in the past. Necromancers were spaced out evenly, and they were mostly placed out in the open. The second zone, Order of the Black Rose, had a mix of necromancers and Daedra duking it out with one another. So I let them kill each other off before I advanced through the rest of the area. By the end of it all, I only needed to shoot down a stunted Scamp and a Dremora. Oddly enough, the Scamp was a tougher opponent than the fully kitted out Dremora Churl. Once all was said and done, I pried the helm off of Jirol's dead body and returned it to Traven at the university. From there, I spoke with Raminus and he promoted me to the rank of Master Wizard, the second highest rank in the guild, just under Archmage. Talking with Hannibal again, he gave me my second last quest of securing the colossal black soul gem from Cylorn. I charged and repaired my weapons in the city, then made my way over to the Alien Ruins. For this one, I knew that Falcar and his groupies did a walk of shame outside for a bit before he flees back into the ruins. My goal was to intercept him, or get one solid kill shot off so I could expedite this whole process. I spoke with the battle mages, got them set up in their preferred places, and then made my way around the side of the ruins. My first attempt, I missed and absolutely nailed one of his followers. This caused Falcar to bolt back inside of the ruin. For my second attempt, I completely missed and decided to just wait for the battle mages to intervene. From there, I tried to block off Falcar's escape. I was sort of successful, but I quickly realized that it was pointless as his health was way beyond anything that my sneak attacks could have lowered down. Ignoring the battle outside, I followed him through the dungeon and began my stealth takedowns. My Cylorn experience was sort of similar to my time in Nenyon Twill. The necromancers were spaced out, their placements predictable, and they were pretty easy to one-shot. I soon found myself in the second zone, Cylorn Biroseli. Here, I took down one more necromancer before running into Falcar. Unfortunately, he had some horrible placement, as he was facing the doorway which was completely lit up, and he spotted me immediately. Either way, our battle had begun, and Falcar was certainly a lot weaker, health-wise, than he was outside. Similar to Karanya, he was a fidgety elf and strafed a lot, completely dodging most of my arrows. Halfway through our fight, he wandered too far into another room, so I decided to fall back a bit. He fell for the bait, and this time around, he didn't have as much spring in his step. Soon, enough arrows pierced his flesh, and Falcar was defeated. Snagging the colossal black soul gem, I fled the ruin and brought it back to Traven. Getting right into the last task for me, Hannibal said that I alone had to face Mana Marco. He named me the guild's new archmage, and then sacrificed himself by trapping his soul inside of the gem. I always chuckle thinking about this from Raminus Pulse's perspective. He's probably been in the guild for years, did everything that Traven asked, and his life's work was probably to run the guild. All of a sudden, a schmo comes along and goes from associate to archmage in 3 days, completely undermining his plans. In order to honor Hannibal and the guild, I left him naked on the ground and swapped out my armor for his robe. In preparation for the final dungeon crawl, I recharged my bows, bought some health potions, repaired my gear, and made one final trip to the Archer's Paradox. To my delight, Daneland finally had some steel arrows for sale. Buying over 100 of them, I was ready to take on the King of Worms himself. This was also technically my last attempt at stealth takedowns and sneak attacks. I wanted this one to go really smoothly, just so I could end on a good note. On the way to Echo Cave, I encountered a pretty strange sight. 2 legionnaires were shooting at each other. I assume one of them missed a deer and struck the other, and now I was here to loot the arrows off of whoever lost. This little tussle went on for some time, but eventually a winner was crowned and I moved on. Arriving outside the caverns, I spotted the doorman, Bolor Savel, and got a pretty good sneak attack in. It didn't kill him, but he did charge in at me with his melee weapon, making it easy to finish him off. Grabbing his key, I entered inside, and Rambo's final mission had begun. There was a mix of a few skeletons and necromancers in the first area. I did pretty well for myself for the most part. There was one spot where I got too complacent and was seen by an enemy, but one shot with the flame bow and she was dead. The chasms soon came next, and the skeletons patrolling there were easy targets. Most of this space was shrouded in darkness, making it really easy to sneak around. Again, most of my success can be attributed to the fact that the necromancers don't have any armor. If they did, then a lot of these one-shot takedowns wouldn't work, and I'd be out a lot more arrows and potions. The first zone was smooth sailing, and soon I was brought to the Echo Passages. There were a couple more chasms here, containing more skeletons, which were just as simple to deal with. It was a lot shorter of a crawl than the previous area, and soon I was on to the final zone of the Necromancer's chambers. Standing outside of the doorway was a Necromancer Adept, which also only took one shot to kill. Now, all that was left was Mana Marco himself. I thought for a fact that the stealth attack against him was going to be so satisfying and effective. After all, he's in a big chamber, standing out in the open. I found the perfect area to line up my shot. I knocked my arrow and let it loose. Of course, the arrow went straight through him. Thinking I had missed at first, I tried again, and still the same result. I went through a variety of different angles and wasted a bunch of ammunition. It was here that I had given up on the dream of a stealth takedown and confronted the King of Worms head on.
I see Bolor was unsuccessful in delaying you. Very well. I shall reanimate him once we are done here. Perhaps we shall chat for a while, since you really have no other options. I must say, I expected Archmage Traven, rather than his star pupil. I am disappointed to see that he could not face me himself. I have met so many of his predecessors over the years. I developed a particular fondness for Galerion, ill-preserved though he may be. But here you are instead, skilled enough to make it this far, which speaks volumes about you. Perhaps you'll be as useful to me as Traven would. Oh, my dear, I didn't mean to imply that you have a choice. I will make you another in a long tradition of worm thralls, and take my time in studying you. Your very soul will be forfeit to me. Power, my dear friend. I seek power, and so I acquire and study those who have some degree of it. We are after the same things, your guild and I. Yet you worry about good and evil, and do not accept they are manifestations of the same thing. So you brand me a villain, and make vain attempts to destroy me. I watch, and I wait, and I collect you when you come for me. Instead of drawing Traven out, I have received you instead. Perhaps I shall personally go and collect him when we are done here.
The conversation ends and the battle begins. Marco summons a spirit to aid him in the fight and pulls out a dagger. He was able to hit me for a lot of health, and I was popping potions left, right, and center. I tried my best to kite him around the small area, keeping my distance and firing off some arrows as I went along. Anytime one of his destruction spells hit, chunks of my HP would get taken out. Eventually, after some time maneuvering around the battlefield, I figured out a decent strategy. I hopped onto one of the pillars and started jumping up and down. This worked well for spacing out his melee attacks, for avoiding the ghost spells, and for avoiding his destruction magic. After some time of lodging arrows into his skull and sternum, the King of Worms, Marco, was defeated. And that just about wraps up the Mages Guild questline whilst playing as a stealth archer. From here, Raminus is spoken with, and there are a few more benefits given to the player. So, that was my first time trying out this playstyle, and here are my thoughts on the sneaky marksman approach. I loved playing through Oblivion like this. It was such a nice switch up from my usual brutish bruiser playstyle. It made me slow down, examine my surroundings, and make calculated moves based on enemy placement. Usually, archery makes it into my major skills rotation, as I like the use of ranged attacks, but it never really gets utilized much beyond pulling in targets for a fight. So to solely depend on it for my offense felt pretty odd at first, but quickly became very comfortable. As for stealth, I really only enjoy doing it when there's an attack multiplier aspect attached. I've never really enjoyed sneaking past enemies and only really use it for nefarious purposes. I'd prefer to leave no NPC behind and defeat them as I go along. So, to be able to systematically eliminate them through stealth means is totally fine and fun for me, but otherwise it isn't my forte. As for changes I'd make, there really isn't much besides putting some more effort and skill points into illusion and intelligence. Since speed isn't really necessary for this playstyle, I'd consider switching it out for intelligence, but it's something I'd have to play around with. It would have been fun to get to use a variety of bows and arrows, which are provided at higher levels, and that's maybe something I'd be interested in doing for the future. If you'd like to see more random playthroughs for quests and whatnot with my boy Bringle, feel free to let me know. Also, coming up for actual challenge runs is the Dark Brotherhood, No Killing, and Main Quest Tutorial Goblin Staff only. If you have any further suggestions, feel free to let me know down below, and until next time, keep on adventuring.